Good evening. This is Dr. Long from Team 15 at CGSC Academic Year 2016. I want to capture the discussion we had at the end of C120 on critical thinking. This is a wrap-up of all the places that we had been that seemed to be of interest. And so I'm going to start over here with the terms of art, and that's going to lead us to looking at different context and ideas as we proceed over here to the left. And I'm going to zoom in so that it's a little easier to read. So in terms of art, we think of biases as predispositions to think in a certain way or blind spots. It's our default position. We may not even be aware of it, but it leads us to look at the world through a particular lens. These develop because they have been successful in explaining many kinds of things about the world, but the very strength of the bias becomes the weakness when you're trying to apply critical thinking, because you can't see the exceptions to the rule, because you tend to discount the things that don't confirm the bias. And in fact, evidence shows that most of the world, when presented with evidence that confounds or contradicts your initial position, causes people to believe in the original position even more strongly. It's an odd, irrational approach to evidence, but it's one that's been well documented in the research literature. And we contrasted biases with fallacies, which we think of as logical errors in processing the components of an argument. So errors in estimating or in treating evidence in a certain way, or illogical transformations. Fallacies are errors in action. Biases are errors in orientation. Heuristics are similar to biases. It doesn't have the loaded word to it, loaded feeling to it. Their negative connotation. But a heuristic is simply a rule of thumb that's been successful and allows us to do fast and frugal decision making when confronted with standard or familiar surroundings or events or triggers. Heuristics are a quick way to avoid getting bogged down in paralysis by analysis. We treated the difference between critical thinking and creative thinking as one of type of thinking. That creative thinking is about trying to generate non-judgmentally as many solutions to a problem as you can, and then critical thinking being the process whereby we assign value to that creative idea. We consider whether or not it has utility. We talked about checklists and SOPs as really being part of a meta-critical creative thinking process, one that allows us to ratchet up our performance by being creative and then critical about our solutions. We can standardize, simplify, apply all the 5 S's of lean thinking, and turn good procedures into good checklists and good SOPs, and we can spread the benefits of the original thinking by distributing the checklists and the SOPs. To not do that is to force others to rely on their own creative and critical capacities to come to those same conclusions. So in my view, and on our view, we looked at checklists and SOPs as being the end product of a creative or critical thinking exercise, or one of the possible pieces. And my experience in change management has been that change that lasts in organizations comes about when you've made fundamental changes to infrastructure, like policies, checklists, SOPs, and so forth. So that's a way to get the work done. One of the ways that we looked at that was this idea of diverging and converging in a professional thinking process. That by starting with the problem set and using divergent or creative thinking to explore broadly, then using critical thinking to converge, we can then produce informed action, which takes into account the best of both worlds of being both critical and creative, and that the natural coming together in the form of practical or professional thinking allows us to blend those other two styles of thought. Mental models are connected to heuristics in ways that we talked about Mental models are like heuristics for organizing our knowledge structurally. They are efficient ways to store rules. They allow us to interpolate between known quantities or to add new material to an existing model because of the logical structure or the sense making that the mental model creates. Much of communication consists of trying to take the mental model that's in your head and transmit that three-dimensional word web into the minds of your communication partner through some kind of linear communication process. That's the challenge with writing, speaking, and reading, is that we're using a linear process to convey information about a three-dimensional model or four-dimensional model in our head, and we're asking the receiver to reconstruct our mental model in their head so that we can then proceed to talk about the mental model that's on the table. We then took a look at a model called the Toulmin argument model, described by the philosopher David Toulmin. We looked at it in terms of these components, these terms of art: claims, evidence, warrants, and rebuttals. Claim is the end state or the conclusion or the recommendation that we hope the listener agrees with. Evidence is the selected facts and assumptions and pieces of reasoning that cause us to support the claim. The warrant is very much like the persuasive argument which says why the evidence is sound and a good sample of the world, and why the logic that ties it together in a narrative should be persuasive to a reasonable person. It's the reason why we're buying the whole story, the whole package. It's the reason to believe. Rebuttals then take the form of an alternative explanation for our facts, or a pointing out of the weaknesses of our argument structure. Good staff work and good, honest cognitive effort consists of identifying the strongest rebuttal to your position and then addressing it, and then demonstrating why, on balance, your recommendation is stronger than the best argument on the other side. That's what we owe our commanders, to give them the best thinking possible on the subject. Scaffolding is the concept that is related to mental models. It is a form of organizing our thoughts, of providing a framework for understanding or experimenting or acting. It is in teaching, it becomes the support structure that allows us to apprehend the meaning of new information. It could be in the form of a sketch like this, or a story, or some organizational structure that allows the student to receive the new information. We talked about the difference between skepticism and cynicism as being the difference between thinking and not thinking. That skepticism is an open mind on a problem that's of interest, that is respectful of data, and is not drawn a conclusion until all the evidence has been considered and various warrants have been explored, as well as rebuttals. It's an open mind that respects data and evidence, and can be persuaded to change a position by reason. Cynicism, on the other hand, is the opposite of thinking. It's where you already know the answer, and typically we take a poor or a dim view of humanity, especially the person trying to make the persuasive argument. And if you are cynical, then you already know the answer and you have stopped thinking. In many ways, it's similar to naive optimism, in the sense that no amount of evidence or reasoning can persuade someone to change their mind if they're in the naively optimistic camp. So we want to adopt a skeptical position, which takes into account a respect for the past, an understanding of the present, and then a respect for the data to allow us to reason about the future. Paradigms or worldviews are large bodies of organized knowledge, many mental models captured and brought together in a comprehensive meta model that allows us to look at the world through a certain lens or think it behaves in a certain way. It's the largest frame of reference that we have, and quite often is unconscious. It explains the world in powerful and fundamental ways. When we think about paradigms and worldviews simply as being matters of perspective, we can look at Dr. Paparone's article and look at these three concepts that help us unpack the ideas of paradigms. The first is, the top level is an ontology, which is a word that means what kind of a world is this? What is the world like? How does it behave? What are the rules of cause and effect? How does it fit together? How does it behave? Epistemology then takes that ontological world, the world as it is, and then asks the question, what is it that we can know? What constitutes good knowledge? How do I tell the difference between true and false, between fact and assumption? How can I know things? And then methodology is the process by which we reliably and systematically go into that world of ontology and then create new information, new knowledge, which builds the epistemology of what it is that we can know. So these three things are linked together in the paradigm. Typically, the paradigm will describe what kind of a world it is, how it is that we can know things, and then what are the means by which we can create that knowledge. So if you think of the world of Army design and MDMP and troop leading procedures, we think of the world sort of in a Western objective, in a scientific way, that we respect design and MDMP as ways of refining our knowledge about the world, and that the methodologies we use are scientific method, respect for evidence, logical reasoning, strategic planning, critical and creative thinking, in order to create the knowledge that builds the epistemology, which gives us insights into the world as it is. We considered two different schools of thought that were related but somewhat different about critical thinking. We looked at the Paul and Elder view of the world, in which we examined closely the 9 standards of intellectual standards, the 9 universal intellectual standards, and then the 8 parts of thought, or the 8 elements of thought. This is an analytical approach to looking at the parts of thinking and then looking at the quality of the reasoning that goes into that thinking as a way to be critical in the philosophical sense of the reasoning. And then we looked at Peter Fassion's work about from the Delphi method that he used in the early 90s to generate a consensus from the professionals in critical thinking to identify 6 different observable, objective skills of critical thinking, which can be taught, learned, evaluated, and assessed, and improved. We talked about this idea here at the top, that that the role of the field grade is sitting in this position of judgment. That you are facing the world, which gives you a situation which demands some action. And on the one side, you have the practical professional world of doctrine, offering you a time-tested solution that has been widely successful. And then we have, on the other hand, your creative impulse, which is how you read the situation, apply your context to it, and then your judgment in deciding how to choose one or the other, or blending them in such a way that we can act in a way that improves our situation as we read the situation. We talked about these 5 elements as being ways to summarize our response to arguments or readings or presentations, or really the classroom activity itself, in terms of what was the best thing about it, what was the worst thing, what was the best takeaway that could be practically applied, how was I surprised about this, how did that challenge my worldview, paradigms, or assumptions, and what is the most interesting question I can ask about this body of knowledge, or this presentation, or this argument, now that I've listened to it carefully. We talked about how the elements of Paul and Elder and Fassion are reflected inside the rubrics for our reading, writing, and speaking, and it is expressed through those contents, organization, style, and correctness components of the rubric, the means by which we will judge our thinking. We discussed this notion that critical thinking is concerned with not just problem solving, but also problem finding to make sure we're working on the right thing, problem framing so that we can determine or make a judgment about what kind of a problem it seems to be as a way to pick a solution that should work for that kind of a problem. And then problem solving is going about applying reasoning to that in a certain way that's connected to the problem framing and problem finding. We talked about mission command as being built on trust and communication, but also the opposite side of the coin. We had some discussions about whether or not an appreciation of professional grade and due diligence ought to be somewhere in that discussion as the basis for justifying the trusting of your leaders or your subordinates or your peers, that there should be some basis for that trust, and judging people and their behaviors and their performance on the basis of professional grade and due diligence is one way to apply the professional standard to determine if the trust decision is justified. And that communication was an important part of this, so that the profession is aware of what professional grade means and what due diligence looks like and what the limits or boundaries or purpose of that trust might be, and that this is a joint responsibility between the senior and the junior in order to fully apply the principles of mission command. We looked at the challenges of auditory learning and an environment in which we can speak at 100 words per minute, and yet we can listen at 500 words a minute, that the space in between the words, our brains are working to test the truth propositions and build mental models and conduct excursions. And what can happen that when we're getting new material and we think we know what those 100 words that we're hearing really mean, and we start extrapolating from there, and then suddenly a new word comes along or a new phrase that sort of invalidates the mental model we were building, and we can feel lost for words or adrift at sea because the time we had, because we're such fast listeners, we may have gone off the beaten path or missed important code words about material that we didn't understand. So when we want to be an active listener, what we're really doing is using that space in between words to really refine our understanding of what is actually being said in order to reflect that back to the presenter, in order to take good notes, ask good questions, and explore this mutual mental model that is in the process of being developed. We talked about this golden nugget about listening to presentations or guest speakers or board work or characterizations of the reading from one of your peers and being able to sound like a field grade by summarizing that information and saying definitively what really interested me about that article, that presentation, whatever, was this. And because I found this compelling, and as a result, I will do something about it, or I will ask a question, or whatever, that we want to come to a position about the material that was presented. We want to have processed it. We want to have thought about it and examined it. And then finally, we talked about this idea of the 4-part learning journal as a systematic way, perhaps, to go about integrating a lot of these basic ideas together. And so in the 4-part learning journal, we talked about how it connects to the Kolb experiential learning model, in the sense that it goes from concrete experience to reflective observation to abstract conceptualization to active experimentation, and thus completing the cycle of each one of those phases of the Kolb model to create learning that lasts. And a way to do that, then, is to have a 4-column learning journal in which the first column you record the aha moment. Perhaps this was the surprising event that triggered your mindful awareness. And then in the second column, you talk about the experience you had in the aha moment. The aha moment records in as much detail as you feel necessary all of the sensory experiences of what it was like, what you noticed, what was going on, how you felt, how did it sound, what did you see, so that we can later unpack the code word or the trigger that caused your subconscious to raise this up as an interesting moment to your conscious awareness. We want to know what it was that triggered you so we can become more intentional about the things that we trigger on. So in the in the second column, we're doing reflection, which we combine reflective observation and abstract conceptualization. This gives you the multi-perspective approach to looking at the thing that seemed to be most interesting to your subconscious. In the action column, having thought our way through this from multiple perspectives, we then commit to a SMART goal to do something about the insight that we had from the moment of the period of reflection. The SMART goal being something that is specific, measurable, action-oriented, relevant to your goals, and a time component whereby this action will be taken. And then the fourth column is where we would record the results of that action that was taken, and then consider the evidence which might end up coming to a new aha moment if something happens or we thought about it in a way that surprises. Maybe that could even become the next mindful moment of the aha moment. And so to the next level, we talked about the different habits of mind or the modes of thinking associated with each one of these columns, and we thought this was useful, that the aha moment is really being mindful, being present, having your sensors up and scanning your environment, being situationally aware in a state of mindfulness. And that reflection combined both critical thinking and creative thinking to examine that mindful moment from many different perspectives to gain deeper insights into second and third order effects. And that the action was a practical form of thinking or action in which you're using the SMART goals, and then in the results we're using professional judgment to respect the evidence and to process in a way that can improve our position. And so the aha moment is really about sensing your environment in terms of problem solving. Reflection is related to the Army design methodology, in which you're considering many different ways in which you could explore that idea or testing different hypotheses. And that in the action column, you've really moved into the world of MDMP to come up with a specific course of action to recommend that looks like a SMART goal that's very specific. And then in the results, we're really relying on troop leading procedures to execute the ideas in the course of action in order to come to reliable conclusions. We thought maybe that the aha moment is best applied by all soldiers as they go about their business in the operational environment. We need everybody to be mindful, scanning their sector, becoming a source of intel and insight. And that the reflection might look like what field grades are really doing the most of. That most of the field work stuff is in reflecting and making sense and figuring out the problem framing and problem finding piece in order to structure the MDMP for captains and lieutenants to develop as staff officers. So we think maybe that kind of MDMP ought to be very proficient at the field grade level. And then commitment to results comes from all soldiers being well trained and well led and executing to standard and conducting our after action reviews and reporting the results to higher with integrity and completeness, so that we can then build towards the next problem to solve. So that's where we spent our time in C120. A lot of things going on in there, and these were some of the big takeaways, the big chunks that we explored, and some of the different ways in which these things might fit together to equip us to think both critically and creatively as we increase our attention to the practical and professional thinking of design methodology, MDMP, and the joint planning process. So these are the fundamental tools and words and processes that we'll use to continue to develop our expertise. So that's Doc Log from Team 15. Thanks for your kind attention. Looking forward to more discussions along these lines. Take good care.